climate change is probably the biggest threat to health today. Prolonged heat, floods and cyclones and hurricanes, forest fires. I mean, we all think about COVID and a future pandemic as being a huge threat to health. But the fact is, right now, it is climate change. Malaria is being seen in places where it was not there before. Dengue is spreading around the world very rapidly. Other vector-borne diseases are popping up. Now, who suffers the brunt of all of this? I believe that science can solve a lot of our problems. The innovative solutions come only when you have different voices, different people with different expertise in the room. Have a questioning mind. Don't accept everything that you hear. If you're looking for some answers on health, be asking a health professional, perhaps not asking a religious or a spiritual leader. So go to them if you have spiritual questions. Health systems around the world need to really start thinking about these new challenges that climate change is bringing upon them.
It is time to reimagine leadership. My name is Ben Owden, and I would like to welcome you to a series of conversations in partnership with Women Lift Health around how can we develop new approaches to the new challenges that leaders face in the 21st century. Greetings to you. I hope you are doing well and are having a meaningful and productive day. Welcome to another episode of the Why Lead podcast, and I'm your host, Ben Owden. We're continuing in our series of conversations around reimagining leadership, brought to you by Women Lift Health. And as we all know, the world is changing. A lot of things are happening. And with all those changes come new challenges. And so how can we develop new approaches in how we think about leadership? And in the context of this conversation today, we'll be looking at that through the lens of healthcare. And so today's conversation will be exploring the interconnected relationship between health and climate change and how transformative leadership can address the complex challenges arising from these two connected domains. And so to have this conversation, I am joined by a renowned pediatric leader who recently served as the inaugural WHO Chief Scientist, and before that, Deputy Director General for Programs, and currently serves as the chairperson of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation. She has published more than 480 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters. Recognized globally for her research on tuberculosis and HIV, she has over 40 years of experience in clinical care and research and has worked throughout her career to translate research into impactful program. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
I guess we can start our conversation by looking at this interconnected nature of, right? On one end, you have climate change, but then you also have healthcare. And I think those two domains bring a lot of complex challenges. And so, and these challenges require like an innovative thinking, innovative approach to address them. And we know that with innovation, you need diversity of thought, you need critical thinking, you need a lot of collaboration for that to happen. And so how do you see transformative leadership playing a pivotal role in addressing these interconnected issues? And what key strategies can leaders employ to drive meaningful and sustainable change in the pursuit of a world where climate change and healthcare are thriving?
Well, thank you very much for this podcast and this question. And it's been very inspiring to be at this Women Lift Health conference in Tanzania and meet so many young women, mostly from East Africa, India, and the US, who are already, very effective leaders in their own countries. So when you think about climate change and health, it is clear that climate change is probably the biggest threat to health today.
Yeah.
I mean, we all think about COVID and a future pandemic as being a huge threat to health. But the fact is that right now, it is climate change that is impacting millions and millions of us around the world. Some of it is direct impacts, and we can see things like prolonged heat, for example, and the increasing number of heat days that we're having many parts of the world. We have, of course, things like floods and cyclones and hurricanes and forest fires. with all the smoke impacting our health. But a lot of our health impacts are also indirect and are not visible. For example, we know that with global warming, that crops are failing, and not only the yields going down, but also the nutritional content in crops is reducing because of the high CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And so malnutrition, which has already been exacerbated, because of all the conflicts around the world and COVID, economic shocks due to COVID, it's likely that more people rather than fewer people are going to suffer from food insecurity and nutrition insecurity in the future. Now, who suffers the brunt of all of this? It is unfortunately women and children. And just like COVID exposed the inequalities in society and the vulnerabilities, climate change does the same thing. It does not create, but it exposes inequalities and vulnerabilities. And so, even within a country, not everybody is equally at risk. Yes, we may all suffer the heat stroke, the heat impact. We may all be affected by a flood. But there are some people who are better able to protect themselves than others because of the resources they have. So certainly the poor and the more marginalized people in society will suffer more. Now, as far as women's own health is concerned, we know that some of these climatic changes have a direct impact, like heat, for example. We know that pregnant women can have more high blood pressure, preeclampsia. They can have stillbirths. They can have more premature babies. And that small babies are much more vulnerable to heat. And so they can develop dehydration very quickly. And therefore, the mortality goes up. So there's more and more data also like air pollution. A lot of women around the world are not having access to clean energy for cooking, for example. So not only are they exposed to air pollution outside, but they're also exposed to indoor air pollution because they're still cooking using solid fuel. So again, water, it's women who are responsible for water and food for their households. And so the burden on women increases, and this reduces the time that they have for their own health and their own care. Now, what should health systems do? I think health systems around the world need to really start thinking about these new challenges that climate change is bringing upon them. The new malaria is being seen in places where it was not there before. Dengue is spreading around the world very rapidly. Other vector-borne diseases are popping up. There are, of course, always a risk of emerging infections because, again, of biodiversity loss and urbanization and the fact that we are much more coming into close contact with wild animals and domestic animals. And so there's always a threat of a new zoonotic infection. So all those threats are there. And at the same time, health systems have to now cope with the increasing burden of some of these illnesses. So that's the first thing. And the second thing they have to do is, I think health systems also need to look at how they can themselves not contribute further to climate change. For example, in many countries now, health facilities are getting solarized. So as you know, still around the world, there are almost 50% of health facilities which do not have electricity and do not have running water. And without those two, how do you provide quality health care? So now instead of using fossil fuel energy, we could leapfrog to using renewable energy, like solar energy, for example, or wind in some places, that will help to provide electricity for the facility so that women and whoever comes there can be taken care of. Deliveries can be conducted even at night. And it will also reduce the fossil fuel emission from that facility because it's not using a diesel generator, but it's switched to renewable energy. So there are both ways, I think, where health systems have to quickly adapt and take care of the needs of people. And they have to also look at their own carbon emissions and reduce it. Now, we have been talking about transformative leadership. And I think transformative leadership is basically being humble. I think it is listening to people, listening especially to affected communities and learning from that and trying to take action on that. It is being collaborative. It is having empathy and compassion. And it is about finding a path forward. We live in a very complex world, complex environment. It's not easy given the limited financial resources that countries have to do certain things. But that's what leadership is about.
I think that was, I love what you have just shared now. And I think having been in the roles that you've been in, when we talk about innovation or problem solving for that matter, right? And especially complex problem solving, things that maybe we've never had to deal with before, right? Where you don't have a clear answer, you don't have a right and wrong answer, right? The answers are not binary where this is what I do and then that is what I do, where you have to figure things out. And more often than not, you fail and you have to iterate until you get to the right answer, right? Being a scientist, being someone who works in a space of looking for better ways to solve, better ways to get to an ideal outcome that you're working with, be it in a project, be it maybe a disease, and how do we get to a point where maybe we have a prescription or medication that can actually address this particular disease. And having worked at WHO as a chief scientist as well, I remember during COVID where how we were all looking forward to what's the announcement? What are we supposed to be doing with ourselves, right? How do you create a culture, I guess, of diversity of thinking? Because you need people who are skilled in different areas. You need people who think differently to come together and have conversations, experiment, fail, and do it again over and over again. How do you create, as a leader, how do you create that space where people are open enough and safe enough to contribute, to challenge, to say, I don't think that's what we should be doing. This may be the status quo, but I think there's probably a better way, which is where innovation, even in healthcare, thrives. So as a leader, how do you create that safe space where people can contribute, where people can be radically honest about what they think about what is happening or what should happen? How do you create that space?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's not easy, I can tell you. And you mentioned COVID. And yes, I was a chief scientist at the WHO at that time. And of course, it was the biggest challenge that any of us had ever faced, because you're faced with the unknown. And at the same time, you have a huge responsibility to people to put out the right kind of advice, the right information in a timely manner, without panicking them. At the same time, sticking to what you know as with facts. But in a situation that's ever evolving so rapidly, every day there were tens, then there were hundreds, and then there were thousands of papers coming out about COVID. So how do you stay on top of all of that rapid generation of knowledge? So we did establish some systems to be able to review the literature on a daily basis, what is happening, what research is going on, what are the new learnings, and then synthesize them and then being able to communicate them to the public. Sometimes it may be a scientific audience, sometimes it's the lay public. So you also have to learn to communicate to different audiences. But the most important lessons there were, firstly, like I said, you have to be very humble. And you cannot go out and say, I know it all, and this is the way it is. Because tomorrow you will find a new piece of evidence which actually has challenged your current understanding. So I think when you're dealing with something that's evolving, your mind has to be open all the time. You cannot have a closed mind. But at the same time, you have to make decisions based on what you know today. You can't say, let me wait for another year. Certainly, so many more people would have died if we hadn't taken the action. Second is that, I believe that science can solve a lot of our problems. We saw during COVID that science enabled us to develop diagnostics very quickly. It was a matter of hours. We had diagnostics and we had vaccines, not one or two, but several vaccines in a matter of 11 or 12 months. Now, this would not have been possible without the investments in science that had happened for decades, for years, So this is why countries must understand that investing in science, investing in research institutions, investing in scientists, in young people, taking a profession in research is very important. The third is, I think, to be interdisciplinary. So you may be a physical scientist or a life scientist, a biological scientist. Social science is equally important. particularly when it comes to something like public health or something that's impacting people. Without those behavioral insights, you're not going to be able to have success in your strategies. And I think too often we forget as doctors, we think, oh, I'm a doctor, I'm telling you, you have to do this. And so why are you not doing it? And behavioral scientists can explain the difference between having the knowledge or the information and being able to act on it. And what is it that makes people act on information? So this is, I think, a very big challenge for us. And then we had this whole challenge of misinformation and disinformation. And we see the same thing in climate science. We have a lot of people saying there's nothing like climate change, it's all a conspiracy, etc. So if you believe and you're a scientist, you have to be able to not just say, I'm not going to listen to this person, but you have to be able to engage and convincingly demonstrate why what you're saying is true, what's the data that backs you. And this communication to people is very important because the anti-science lobbies, unfortunately, know how to communicate. They are able to scare people. They're able to frighten them, or they use, such out of the way kind of examples that it catches people's attention. So I think, again, public health communication is very important. Now, we talked about being interdisciplinary. I think that for climate, this is very, very important because the innovative solutions come only when you have different voices, different people with different expertise in the room. You don't get good solutions if it's a very homogeneous group of people sitting and talking to each other. So I have always found in my own life and career that I sometimes have gone into the community with a preset view of things. But I have been humbled because when I speak to the community, they say, that's not our problem. That's not our priority. Why are you coming and lecturing to us about something? These are our issues. Why don't you solve them first? So I think the voices of affected communities is important. Civil society, young people, older people, women, men, children, each one has a different perspective. So I think really for policy making, you must listen to all voices and all points of view. Of course, you have to be based on the best evidence and data. It's not that you should go by people's opinions, but you must hear everyone. And then in the room, when you're making that policy or making laws or making a decision, you need to have people with different views. And you asked a very good question about how do you create a safe space. Very difficult. But as a leader, I think that's one thing you can do, is to create a safe space in your own organization or in your own sphere of influence, where people know that just because they say something which may be against the prevailing views, that they're not going to be punished or singled out or ridiculed or made fun of, but that they will be listened to at least, and with respect. So I think, again, that's one of the qualities of a leader, is that you don't diminish people or treat them because of their views may be different from yours. You must listen, and then you must engage in a process of decision making, which is democratic and inclusive.
Yeah, I agree with what you said there. I definitely think one of the skills for leadership is the ability to have an elastic and expansive worldview, where you can take in thoughts and ideas from people that maybe even you feel like on a fundamental level you disagree with, but to have that elasticity where I can take this in and wrestle with it and think about it without being so reactive, which is where sometimes I think, because people probably observe, if somebody shared an idea and they were shut down and you shouted and then you're sending a message to everyone else that, if your ideas are different than mine, they're not accepted here. There's a statement the business leader called Maverick Carter said. He said, if two people agree all the time, one of them is unnecessary. And going back to what you said earlier around having people who are different from each other, right? Sometimes we find safety in a homogenous group because we're all alike. And that safety is sometimes necessary, but I think when we come to think about science, safety is not necessarily the ingredient that you want, because problems are being born every day, and you always want to make sure that you are ahead of the curve. There's a metaphor, story, a parable that I came across reading a book called Ignorance by Stuart Firestein, who's a microbiologist from Columbia University. And he talks about science using these two metaphors. One metaphor is there is a drunk man looking for his lost keys. And he's outside standing, and it's not dark at night, but there's a lamp post and there's a light, street light, and he's busy looking for his keys. And then someone drives by and they see them and they stop their car, they get out and they ask them, what are you looking for? And he says, I'm looking for my lost keys. And so, he starts looking for those lost keys with him. And then after a while, he says, where did you lose them exactly? And he said, well, over there in the dark. And then he said, so why are we looking for them here? He's like, well, this is where the light is. And his view is that, sometimes we can approach science and life and leadership that way, right? Doing what is the norm, what is safe, where is comfortable. And the other metaphor he uses is that think of a person walking into a dark room, pitch dark, black room, looking for a black cat, and there might not be a cat in that room. And he says, science is often like that, walking into the unknowns, sometimes the known unknown, right? And being comfortable being in that dark room as you look for answers. And it's easier said than done, but I think in your own experience, having been in those dark rooms, I think COVID is one example, but I'm sure you've been in many dark rooms, looking for that black cat. How can people who are not operating in the domain of science, because I feel like with scientists, it's so natural to be that way. It's required, it's fundamental to be that way, right? But I think in many other domains, especially in leadership, people like to be in the light, looking for lost keys when you didn't drop them there, right? Because it feels confident. This is when you see leaders who see themselves as people who are there to provide answers. And so even if you don't know, you don't really say you don't know. You just give an answer because you feel like this is what I'm here to do. We're afraid of questions. We're afraid of the unknown. So leaders who are outside of the domain of science, what can they learn from scientists so that they can get to a place where they're a lot more comfortable being in the dark?
I think the first thing is to have a questioning mind and don't accept everything that you hear as a gospel truth. Try to question it or think about whether something sounds like it could be rational, it could be feasible. Because unfortunately, today we live in a world of social media where especially young people, I think today are bombarded all the time by so much information. And still in a lot of places, people are getting their information from social media. They're not getting the information from other, maybe credible sources like the public health experts or leaders, but they're collecting it secondhand from social media. So this is where one has to be very careful about the information that's coming through. And I remember during the COVID, the WHO used a term called infodemic, which is really an epidemic of information just floating around. And some of it is good, but a lot of it is not correct or credible. So you have to be questioning. Secondly, you have to try to seek the answers from people and from the right people. So if you're looking for some answers on health, you should be asking a health professional, perhaps, not asking a religious or a spiritual leader about answers to health issues. You go to them if you have spiritual questions. You have to be willing and open to listen and learn from different sources. And I think it also goes back to our teaching and training in school, because if you do not develop what is called a scientific inquiry mind or scientific spirit, you may or may not grow up to be a scientist, but I think science literacy is important for everyone. Just like we say health literacy, you cannot afford not to know certain basic things about how to protect your health and how to live a more healthier life. Everyone needs to have those facts. So I think science literacy is similar, and it depends on what kind of, I think, education and exposure you have at home, at school, etc. Um, and then it's it's an interdisciplinary kind of um, field as well. And today, all the major advances are coming through that. So I think, you were asking, if you're not a scientist, then how do you deal with this explosion of information and knowledge? A lot of it could be very valuable and could be very useful for you, and a lot of it is actually just rubbish and needs to be, ignored, and certainly not transmitted forward. And I think it can only come by developing this questioning kind of a mind, being able to check facts, and a skill that people will need now in the future, especially with artificial intelligence really going to play a big role in all, is how to ask the right questions and how to not believe everything that is being told to you, even if it's generated by artificial intelligence. And then what's the difference between the human mind and an AI? There are certain things that we have, like empathy and the feeling of humanity, the feeling of solidarity, and certain things that we understand about our living environment and nature and society and communities, and like the family ties we have, that an AI is not going to be able to understand, I believe. And so I think the children of today and the future, probably the way that they're educated, they will not need to learn facts. When we were growing up, we were told to memorize a lot of facts.
Yeah.
That's how we studied. You don't need to memorize any facts now. It's all available for you. You can look them up. But I think some of these skills of critical thinking, but more importantly, of creativity, of understanding human society and being able to be part of that. We're seeing a lot of young people today feeling alienated because they live in the virtual world. They're not really that tightly socially connected as I think it's healthy to be. And this is leading to what is called eco-anxiety. It's leading to high levels of depression and anxiety among young people. So these are some of the worrying trends, I think, that we have to take seriously and look for solutions for some of them. But I think that, yes, the conversations between scientists and society at large, I think, is also very important. Scientists tend to do your work quietly. You're not necessarily talking to the community about it. You publish your papers in your journal of whatever is your specialty, and you're very happy if you get good papers published in good journals. You go to scientific conferences, people understand what you're saying. But I believe more and more that scientists have a responsibility also to society to engage in these discussions and to be challenged. And I think that's very healthy. It also stimulates your own mind when you are asked questions, particularly by young people.
Wow. Well, and I think because I was going to ask you, and I'm glad that you brought that up in terms of how can we begin to communicate all of this, because I think people who are outside of the science domain, maybe they're not aware of a lot of these things, the risks that you just communicated earlier around climate change and healthcare, and who are the marginalized that will be affected the most by this. Because I feel like sometimes when you're living in your own world and you're unaware of what's happening outside of yourself, you feel like, yeah, I mean, maybe there are all these risks, but I'm not affected. But not realizing that not everyone shares your context. Not everyone shares maybe the privilege that you have in having access to all the measures that you can take to protect yourself and to make sure that you and your loved ones are doing well. So I'm glad that you mentioned that whole making sure that the communication that's used as well is something that translates well to the layman. And I also loved what you said there, having a questioning mind, which I think is easier said than done, because we thrive in safety as human beings, and anchoring bias is a big part of it, where first piece of information that you have, you find safety in it. This is the truth. I'm going to stick to it. And the ability to unlearn is very hard, because unlearning brings with it a sense of loss. I have to let go of this thing that I once believed. And I think if there are layers of faith involved in them, and tradition and culture and identity, then it becomes extremely hard. And that's why you find people who probably find it much easier to run to, their spiritual leaders versus going to a scientist, because they'll probably reinforce something that you hold dear to you.
Yes.
And you find safety in that, even if it's not necessarily something that you should be doing. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And I think starting earlier is probably much easier when people are young.
Correct.
But I think there's still opportunity for even those who are adults to actually learn and develop that. Now, as we're wrapping up our conversation, there's a question that we ask pretty much all of our guests called the 111. What is the one book that you've read at some point in your life and career that you say, if I had a time machine and I go back, I can take this with me? What is the one habit that you developed at some point in your life and career that you say, I wish I had started practicing this earlier? And then what is the one personal value that you'll say, I will not compromise this no matter the cost? What is the one book, one habit, and one personal value?
So as far as the books are concerned, I think that there are a lot of books that I've read on nature and on, how civilization and how it's changed. But I would say the person who's really influenced me and probably millions of people around the world is David Attenborough, not only through the books, but also through the wonderful shows.
Yeah, the documentaries.
The documentaries that he's done. I think that is really the best way, by image. I think the moving world, the imagery is so much more, it stays with you forever and you realize what the world is and what we might lose. In terms of habits, I think that physical activity and exercise is something that I've become extremely, I would say even obsessive about. And this is not a habit that I had as a young person. It came to me much later in life. But I realize how important it is for both physical and mental health. And the day that I don't exercise, I'm not feeling as bright and optimistic as the days that I've got my exercise in. So whatever kind of exercise, it could be inside your room, it could be yoga, it could be swimming, walking, cycling, anything. And the third one you said is a value, right?
Yeah, personal value, yeah.
I think it's being honest to myself and not doing anything that, I wouldn't want others to do. So trying to live a life with integrity and not compromising on certain very basic things. I mean, that's sort of small things you compromise on, but I think there are some certain basic values like honesty and being true to yourself, not cheating people, that I would not compromise on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumya, for your time. This has been an insightful conversation. You've given me a few things to reflect on and think on. And I am sure this has been an inspirational conversation, even for our audience. We've come to the end of our conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure interacting with you.
Thank you. And to our dear listener and those who are watching, this has been the Why Lead podcast. I am your host, Ben Owden.